Well, I was pretty nervous because I definitely did not want to wear a necktie to come over here.
All right.
But Richard had asked me to come, and I thought, oh boy, I'm going to have to wear a necktie. Everybody's going to be wearing a necktie when I get here. And so glad to know he's the oddball.
Should have known that already.
Well, see, never having been here before, I didn't know if he'd be the oddball, if I would be the oddball once we got here. But nevertheless,
We're all oddballs here.
we are. Let me, I'm going to share with you my message. It's going to be pretty much sharing some thoughts from my heart, kind of where I am in my life. And that's pretty much what I've done most of my adult life in speaking in churches. I just had the privilege, because I was connected with Lake Aurora, that when I went into a church to speak, I didn't have to preach a great oratorical sermon. I just basically was able to tell people kind of where we were, you know, in things. And that's pretty much where I still am, because that's just who Bill Redman is. I will say, though, by the way, I did bring the big canoe, and you may not realize this, Richard, but I am of Tuscarora Indian descent, and the New York Tuscarora. They're also in South Carolina. And so, in theory, my heritage, I guess, goes back to the big canoes, because they come out of Canada, and they were used in the fur trading industry. That's basically what developed them. They weren't used in the South. And in the Pacific Northwest, they basically had the big trees, and they would do big dugouts. We did little dugouts here in Florida. Those are very long ones. But anyway, so I guess I have that, except my mother, the only thing I ever remember my mother telling me about the Tuscarora descent, and back in somewhere back in there we had somebody hung as a horse thief. So somehow no canoeing never came up into that. But nevertheless, we're going to have some fun with them. If you like to play Scrabble, let me just tell you, these canoes are big enough. You can play your Scrabble game in the canoe. All right, you don't have to keep it inside the building. I want to share a passage with you. This is pretty much where I am in my life at this point. And it comes from the 11th chapter of Matthew, and I'm just going to read the first 6 verses. After Jesus had finished instructing his disciples, he went on from there to teach and preach in the towns of Galilee. When John heard in prison what Christ was doing, he sent his disciples to ask him, "Are you the one that is to come, or should we expect someone else?" Jesus replied, "Go back and report to John what you hear and see. The blind receive their sight, the lame walk, those who have leprosy are cured, the deaf hear, the dead are raised, and the good news is preached to the poor. Blessed is the man who does not fall away on account of me." You know, Jesus said about John the Baptist that he was the greatest of people born among men. He was the greatest. So you can't get any higher compliment than that. And that's who John was. So the question to me is kind of curious. Why would John, who had this very special role, this man who obviously was very in tune with God, why he would ask this question? Are you the one, or should we be looking for somebody else? Yeah. That's an interesting question. Think about if you got asked that question. First of all, those of us with insecurity issues, why are you asking me that? That's a pretty tough question to take. And here Jesus was out working hard. He already understood that he was going to be giving his life for this, and here this John, this very one who had said, he's greater than I am, now he's asking, are you the one or not? And wow, what could that do to an ego? So I just want to explore with you a little bit why that question would be asked. Well, obviously he's asking it because maybe he had a misconception as to what he was expecting to happen. Maybe he was in prison. Jesus was on the outside. He was misunderstanding. Maybe it was just out of, I don't know. I'm not hearing anything. Somebody tell me if anything's happening. if we bring that down to the church, there are a lot of people in the world that look at the church. In fact, the whole world looks at the church because we kind of make ourselves visible. We build big buildings, and we put them in prominent places, so people have to see us. Sometimes church buildings are the most expensive building in the community, and that means that, wow, they're going to be seen. A lot of times, particularly in our history in the past, the preacher of the church was perhaps the most influential person within that community, and certainly was raised up on pedestals. There was a time when preachers of churches could go in most any store in a community, and that store would automatically give them discounts just because they were the preacher of that church. So, you know, we pretty well made ourselves targets. You know, and the church has pretty well made itself a target. If there's an issue, a political issue, the church is pretty quick to choose a side and to become pretty vocal about their position on that particular issue. I mean, we've made ourselves very visible, and so it's not unusual when something like the Twin Towers happens and somebody starts asking about, well, where is God? You know, and start looking at the church and asking the questions, well, where is God in all of this? Because we've held ourselves up as God's representatives, and suddenly when people have questions, they're going to be looking at us, well, where is God? And so it's a very interesting question to ask, and we're going to feel that in today's climate about this. So it's that question that I want to try and answer this morning, and as Jesus answered it for John. Jesus' answer totally is not the answer that I'm sure his disciples were thinking. If he had asked one of the disciples, what do you think they would have said? Okay, well, I'm thinking they would have said, come on, he fed 5,000 people out of one little boy's lunch. You know he walked on water, don't you? He did that. You know, he walked into the temple and he just chased everybody out because they were doing things wrong. Okay? He spoke and into the synagogue, and after it was over, they wanted to throw him over a cliff, but he turned around and just walked right through them. He had so much nerve. You know, one time, he was preaching, and the crowd was so big, they actually tore a hole in the roof to get down to him. Okay? I mean, think of the stories they had to be able to tell to answer John. John, look, I know you wear camel's hair and you drink weird food, okay? Okay, we know that. However, look at what he is doing. But that's not the answer Jesus gave, because that isn't where Jesus was. And it's interesting, when he gave his answer, there wasn't a follow-up question that came back from John. And that's pretty significant, because there was no follow-up question, at least none recorded here. So what he says is, well, look, just tell him what you see and what you hear. The blind are seeing, the lame are walking, good news is being preached to the poor, some people are being raised from the dead. Just tell him these things. Go back and tell him what you're seeing and hearing, because that's what I'm doing. I want to focus the church on that particular issue right now. I'm so glad that Denny is here. Okay? Denny, I love you. I thank you for being here. You see, when I left Lake Aurora was a very vital ministry within the church. And it was easy to go into churches and talk about what's happening at Lake Aurora. We had 130 kids being baptized this year at summer camp. You know, and you'd get a round of applause. And then Wendy, after Wendy and I became married, after I lost my first wife, she had the experience. We'd walk into a church and unannounced, we'd just be sitting in the back, and it wasn't unusual for somebody at the announcement time to welcome me from Lake Aurora, just being in their audience, and suddenly the audience started clapping. You know, and that was a strange feeling. Now, they weren't clapping for me, they were clapping for the ministry of Lake Aurora. So it's kind of easy to be connected with something like that, because we did a lot of things. In fact, canoeing was a part of what we did. I grew up in my high school years in East Point, Georgia. And my father was president of Atlanta Christian College, and so I graduated from high school in East Point. And it was while I was in high school there that I actually came to Florida and went to camp at Lake Aurora. So I had a kind of a long history to Lake Aurora. But as the years pass, and I'm directing Lake Aurora, and my classmates from my class at Russell High School now are influential within the Atlanta community. My dad, I remember telling me one time he had to go to one of the banks to arrange a loan for a building that was going to be built on the campus of Atlanta Christian College. And it just so happened the first vice president that he had to deal with was one of my classmates from my high school class. And his name was Marlon Morris. And so Marlon asked my dad, so, well, what's Bill doing these days? And my dad has to say, well, he's out canoeing. I know you're first vice president of this financial institution, and my son's out canoeing. Okay, you know, but it wasn't just canoeing. But nevertheless, there was a lot of things that come out of that. And so, having come from that background, after I retired from Lake Aurora, there was one burden that always stayed with me while I was at Lake Aurora. And it was a burden that was presented when I first came to the organization. When I came to the organization in 1972, we were running what was called a family camp over a particular holiday. And at that family camp, there was a young lady that came by the name of Elizabeth. Now, Elizabeth was a teenager, well, a late teenager. She was very crippled from birth. She was probably, on our terms, about a 3-year-old, but she loved camp. She just loved coming to camp. It was just a place she knew. Her family would say when they said they were going to come to camp, she just lit up, and she came to camp. And Elizabeth, as is fairly normal, passed away young in life. And so her family, he was a mailman, a postman, and they didn't have much money, and but they took and they gave a gift to Lake Aurora in Elizabeth's memory. I remember taking that gift and thinking, now we've got to do something to remember Elizabeth. And Elizabeth always had a hard time getting around on the campus because she was in a wheelchair, and our original building was 48 inches off the ground, you know, with nothing but steps going into it. We didn't have sidewalks connecting our meeting spaces, and so what we did with her money, with that money that was given, we built our first wheelchair ramp into that 48-inch building. And that was early on. We built it. There wasn't a whole lot of money, so we got somebody cut up some utility poles for us to help us get the lumber, to be able to have enough lumber to build this. So we built this wheelchair ramp. Never did get her name put on it. Always intended to. Never did get her name put on it. But it just hung with me. Now, I was at Lake Aurora for 34 years, being the director of the camp. This just always hung with me. Elizabeth, just the vision of Elizabeth. And so as we continue to develop the campus, I'm thinking, well, how do we get a wheelchair from point A to point B? And finally started putting in a few sidewalks to connect things, but we really never ever did anything significant. If somebody asked me if we accommodated people with disabilities, I'd say yes, we do. And what I meant was, just like all of our churches do, if they want to show up, they're welcome. Okay, that's pretty much what it meant. Yeah, we're gonna, you know, but we weren't doing anything special. And we tried. Said, you know, we really need to have a specialized program here for people with disabilities. And so, like all of our programs at Lake Aurora, we would bring the church together, the various churches. And we had a lot of churches, and some of them were fairly large. And we'd bring churches together, and we'd say, okay, now, is this a program that we can do. And you know, it never happened. And the reason it never happened, because there was not one church in the Lake Aurora constituency that really had a ministry to people with special needs. It wasn't one, not one. And so we didn't have a nucleus that we could connect together. That always bothered me. But there was enough to keep me busy. I had my canoe, so it wasn't a problem. So eventually I retired from Lake Aurora, from the job as the director. And when I married Wendy, she was a speech therapist, so that kind of moved me a little closer to a special field. And she got on the board of an organization in Lake Wales called Circle of Friends Ministry. And then eventually I got on the board of Circle of Friends Ministry. But as I began in this network, I'm thinking, wait a minute, I'm a camp director. I know how to run camps. I can start a camp. So we started a camp called Camp Friendship. And it was basically for the special needs community there. And it was in Lake Wales. And I said, okay, we're going to start a camp. We're going to call it Camp Friendship. I didn't work for Lake Aurora anymore, so we had to rent Lake Aurora, okay? Because before, it was always working with the churches. Fine, you know, it's a church thing. Now it's not a church thing, okay? So we rent Lake Aurora. And then suddenly I realized, wait a minute, if we rent Lake Aurora, that's money. I got to pay. I got to have some money. I don't have the money to do this. And the population that we're serving didn't have the money. What I did have was a big canoe. So, and we had Winter Haven chain of lakes, and I knew there was a restaurant. So we just got simply 4 of those students from Circle of Friends and 2 of their staff members, about 3 or 4 others of us to help paddle. We said, we're going to paddle to lunch. And so we announced it, and then we all raised sponsorship. You know, we raised $3,000 paddling to lunch to pay for that first Camp Friendship.
Awesome.
And the next year I thought, we're going to do it again. And so I got a few more people to help raise money for our canoe. And then at that time there was a missionary that I'd known who had a special needs daughter. And as most families who have people who are dependent upon them, they think, well, what happens when I age out? Who's going to take care of them? Okay, that's a real issue. And that was a real issue for this family, particularly since they were a missionary family and they didn't have funds. I knew they had started a trust fund many years ago to try and supplement Social Security income so they could put her in a group home eventually. And I donated to that trust fund. So I happened to see him, and I said, Mike, I said, how's a trust fund coming? He said, well, there's really not enough money in it yet. I said, well, I don't have any money, but what I have is I have a canoe. I said, I have 3 of these big canoes. I said, I have a canoe. And I told him what I was doing with my one canoe. I said, I'll give you a canoe to use if you can figure out how to make money off of it. Well, you know, he had some church connections, so a church stepped in and said, Mike, we will match anything your donors, your paddlers raise up to $3,000. Well, you make a match like that, they're going to raise $3,000. So they had $6,000, you know, paddling in their canoe. And as it turns out, we had $6,000 paddling in our canoe. We had a $12,000 fundraiser paddling to lunch. I will say that his paddlers were healthy. Our paddlers were not healthy. Okay, that 2 miles to lunch was all that our crew wanted to do. His crew was very disappointed because they had driven from the coast. They said it took us longer to drive here than it did to paddle this thing. But nevertheless, you know. So all I'm trying to get to that is that suddenly, through some very strange ways, none of them coming through the front doors of the church, we're suddenly moving into a different field we haven't been into before. And I started paying attention. See, there was a camp right down the road from Lake Aurora, the Florida Lions camp, and it used to be for the visually handicapped, and they began opening up to people with all disabilities. And then when they really started struggling financially, they just said, we're an inclusive camp, anybody can come. All right, and then it closed, okay, because they couldn't make it. And now suddenly here, but there was a population that was being served that no longer is being served. And so, you know, Lake Aurora is sitting there, and I literally worked put together a team to try and buy the Lions Camp. I said, we got to keep a program going. The more I looked at it, and the more I studied, the more I said, no, you know, for that same amount of energy, or for less energy and less money, we can make Lake Aurora the premier campus for programs who are serving people with disabilities, because we have so many more things going. And we had the churches connected in. The churches. Because, you see, that question, are you the church or should we look for another? If we had to give the answer the way Jesus gave the answer,
Yeah, right.
you know, that's a scary thought. It really is. And I'm not comfortable with that. I'm especially not comfortable with that when I move to the 25th chapter of Matthew and they give that judgment scene. And he says, you know, and you got the goats and the sheep, and the thing that caused them to actually get in or not get in, be separated, was basically how they were working with people in need in their community. It was that simple. And I'm thinking, wow, you know, that's, you know, these are things that actually keep me awake at night. And so I'm thinking, wow, you know, that just, you know, how can we help the church be more effective in this area? I know as I grew up and as I worked with a church, there's a dynamic, and I'm going to consider it an unhealthy dynamic within the church. And that is, I got to be careful what I say here, because I will get shot for this.
Say it.
Okay.
Whatever you got to say.
We are too American.
Too, Bill. Go ahead. Shoot.
We are too American. Now,
Okay.
I'm not saying not be patriotic. I'm not saying don't fight for our country. I'm not saying don't put a flag in your... But we're too American. Jesus wasn't an American.
Right.
He was something else. His culture was far different than ours. You see, Jesus taught his disciples because they had a very ungodly government and who had taken them over, and they were an occupational community. And Jesus and the Christian community, when it says, well, if there's if one of these Roman soldiers that's occupying you, you know, it was the law. You had to carry, if he asked you, you had to help him get his stuff a mile down the road. So he said, you know what, as a Christian, when he asks you to take his stuff a mile down the road, take it 2 miles. That was how they dealt with those issues. The church, my experience with the church is, if the government says ADA requires you to do this, you start looking for a loophole to make sure you don't have to do it, because that's the government telling us to do it. Okay? And I'm thinking, okay, now how does that fit with Jesus saying go the second mile? See, and I find a disconnect there within the church. But we're so independent. We're so independent because we live in a country that allows us to be independent. I'm happy with the independence. I love where I live. I can't even see another house.
Praise the Lord.
We have so much privacy where we live. We have an outdoor shower with no walls. Okay? I mean, we live in the Gaboonies. All right? We really do. All right? It is a great place. You know, I'm just hoping that those cows that are next door really are cows. Okay?
But the satellite.
Well, it's under an oak tree, so that's helpful. So, but you know, we somehow need to come back and move out of our culture, because that may have been one of the reasons that John was asking the question of Jesus, because there was a culture, and there were some of Jesus' disciples like Simon the Zealot who really thought Jesus was coming to expel the Roman government. That's why he was there. And he gets this answer back, well, just go back and tell him that the blind are seeing, the lame are walking, you know, good news is being preached to the poor, you know, give me some of this information. Wow. You know, and so as we look at the church, and as the church develops, you know, that becomes an issue as to how we can do that. Let me just tell you where this has gone from this little Camp Friendship. This year 2011, there will be, and I'm not here to promote Lake Aurora, I'm just here to talk about the church, because Lake Aurora is the church working together. There are 6 programs this year specifically serving people with disabilities being held at Lake Aurora. Now, I can't tell you they're all promoted by the Christian church, because they're not. Okay? But I had the privilege of working with everyone, and I go and I meet with the leaders of these camps ahead of time. And I'm so impressed with what they're doing. And I'm saying, guys, how can I help you? A year ago, we had the camp called Special Touch, run basically out of the Assemblies of God. I was so impressed when I'm there, seeing what they're doing, and seeing people being baptized into Christ in their program. I was just very impressed when they had an autistic man who wanted to be baptized so badly, and he was deathly afraid of water. But he wanted to be baptized, and to see that conflict come place, and he's got a life preserver on, he's surrounded by friends, and he's out there crying, literally crying, and the group's just talking to him, trying to help him, and he's wanting to be baptized, but he's deathly afraid of the water at the same time. And they're just out there talking with him, and then they begin singing with him, and eventually you begin to see him relaxing. And you see that life jacket, that he's a fairly tall man, that life jacket sticking above the water, and you just begin to see it go down and down, and pretty soon you see the water coming up on the life jacket a little bit, and finally, when he's ready, you see them lay him back into the water. And you see that and you say, wow, this is the church.
Praise the Lord.
This is the church. And so I went over and met with these people. I said, I want to know what these leaders are doing. I want to know what their other needs are. And they're telling me about our paths that connect our beautiful dining hall to our air-conditioned cabins. And we have these stabilized paths that are made with asphalt millings, which are just a whole lot better than the sand was or the wood chips that we had before them. But for a wheelchair, they lost 3 people, fell out of wheelchairs, rolling them on those paths. And they had put plywood over all the soft spots that they could find to try and I'm thinking, wow, you just can't do that. You just can't do that. And so I began to work on things. So between that year and this year, here's what happened. The church responded. We were able to get for them a beach wheelchair, special beach wheelchair to get their people down to those baptism services for swimming, and that's a rather expensive item. We were able to get, they said they needed Hoyer lifts. You know what? I didn't even know what a Hoyer lift was. I said, a what? Hoyer lift. They spelled it out for me, H-O-Y-E-R, and I said, well, what is it? And they said, well, the problem is, many of these, they said that severely disabled, they have to be picked up in this lift and moved over into their bed, okay, or to take a shower, they have to be picked up. They couldn't get them into the showers. They needed to be put in a rolling shower chair to be able to give them a shower. And so they started giving me their needs, and I started making a list. And I put that on my list. I said, this is going to happen. You know, we're the church. You know, we're the church. And we put the word out. This was the most fantastic thing. Down to these shower chairs. I kept thinking, okay, we're going to find somebody who can give us shower chairs. Not finding it. So finally I asked Phyllis at Lake Aurora, I said, Phyllis, I said, can you send out some kind of a thing to ask people if they can help us get shower chairs? Well, she had a mailing list that had just a few people on it, but it had people that had been at the father-son retreat. Their names happened to be on this little mailing list. So she sent out this little constant contact email thing asking for help to get shower chairs. Now we needed 4. We needed 4 shower chairs. Almost immediately, I mean within 2 or 3 hours of that going out. We had a family send us out of one of our churches who had been in a father-son retreat. And they said, you know, our family's going through a divorce. Money is extremely tight for us right now. But this is something that we just felt like we should help with. And so the 2 children and the father had all had a family powwow, and they decided they were going to buy one of those shower chairs. They're like $150. Okay, one of those rolling shower chairs. And then we hear from another church, and they want to buy a shower chair. And then we have a family writes us and said, you know, we've been praying, and this seems to be the answer that God is giving us. We want to buy 4 shower chairs. We wound up with 6 shower chairs in less than 24 hours
Great.
when that was sent out. And that's from God's people.
Yeah. Awesome.
That's from God's people. The beach wheelchair came much the same way. We had to get those paths paved, you know, and a good friend out of the Legacy Church, that became a burden to him, a real burden to him, and he was able to make the contact that allowed us to get those paths paved between the camps. So when that group came back this year, oh, they couldn't quit singing the praises of all these improvements, because they weren't, you know, they could actually travel these paths. And I kept telling the Lake Aurora staff, because, you know, all that's more work, okay? I kept saying, guys, I need to understand something. This is like an onion. Whatever we get done this year, it's only going to expose something else that needs to be done, because we've not reached the core yet. And so I meet with them shortly to start building the next list. I've already got things on it. A specially made golf cart to be able to get wheelchairs up on it, because, you know, you're still limited to the paths. Okay, what about the campfire? Okay, these people literally, in this population, a young man who literally has to be put in a sling, used one of those Hoyer lifts, climbed our 33-foot tower. Okay, now, in his mind, he climbed it. Maybe not the way we climb it, but a group of Christians came in with special block and tackle. And as he goes up that wall, with his hand, he is literally touching every one of those rocks as he goes up. We had one of the national camps for the blind here this year. First time I've ever run support for a blind camp. They wanted horseback riding. We organized horseback riding for them. They wanted to go tubing behind a power boat. Wendy and I drove the boat. It's funny. I love the blind community, because they have a sense of humor. They really do. You know, and there was a guy holding on to that tube, his face buried into it, you know, and we're pulling him along, and I'm talking to Wendy. I'm running. She's driving and look out, and I'm saying, look, he doesn't want to look and see where he's going. He can't see where he's going. I did team building with them. I do team building with corporate groups, and I had this one where I put down this carpet on it's really a big tarpaulin, and then they get about 10 people standing on this thing, and I say, oh guys, I made a mistake, it's upside down. And they have to turn it over without getting off of it. Now they're blind, okay? Well, one group really got it over pretty quick, and that was the group of, now, even within the blind community, I found that they have terms they use. They have what they call totals. And so this one had the most totals in it. It was in this group here. They got theirs turned over the fastest of the other group, you know. And then I said, okay, guys, now that you're done, you can open your eyes and see what you did. And they just laughed, you know. So I love that with that community, because they climbed that 33-foot tower totally blind. Climbed it, and this time they really were climbing it. We had to tell them where the holes were. Okay, there's one by your right knee. They'd feel it, and they'd feel it, and they'd put their foot up. Literally climbed the tower. Now these are great experiences, these people. But you know what? One of the people at that camp was baptized into Christ. Okay, at that camp. Now this was run by the Seventh-day Adventists. This wasn't coming out of one of our church groups. Okay. But we're able to support them and connect with them, because they're still sharing Christ with them. Still sharing Christ with them. So these various groups, you know, this is the church coming together. So, you know, in a sense, my view is, wow, I always felt that Lake Aurora was one of those points where, because churches come together, you know, if you want to impact something, toss a pebble, you know, where it's going to make the most impact, those ripples will go out. So I said, well, okay, well, if we can get it going there, maybe we can get it going in all of our churches, and maybe we can work things out. So you go back and you look at John's question, are you the church, or should we look for another? We need to be careful and make sure that what people are seeing about what we're doing It's the church. It's the church. It's the love of Christ being shared. One last story here, and it ties into canoeing. I wanted to help people with disabilities, and you have to raise money. And so I organized a kayaking event called Paddler's Care Paddle Challenge. It's going to be on Lake Kissimmee, and we're going to raise money for various causes. And so in the process of doing that, I thought, okay, how do I find where all the kayakers are? I know there's got to be a lot of kayakers in Florida. How do I find them? And I found out that there is no central connecting point for kayakers. They are everywhere. Okay, nobody knows how many of them there are. But I found this one organization called Florida Paddling Trails Association, and they seem to have on their website connected most of the paddle clubs. And then I found out you got paddle clubs, and then you got meetup groups, which are maybe even bigger than paddle clubs. And then I didn't know a paddler was a member of a paddle club or a meetup group. They were all just independent. So I just didn't know. Anyway, so I joined this group. I saw there was an event that they were holding. They weren't holding, but it came out of the meetup group, that there was a meetup that's going to be on a creek that's right near where I live. And it's a creek that I didn't think anybody knew about. So I went over to meet them. Met a lady by the name of Lynette. And so we're talking, and she found out about Camp Friendship, and she was a nurse. She says, I want to volunteer for Camp Friendship, to be the nurse at Camp Friendship. That's great, you know, and I started emailing, and I go on the website, on her Facebook, and realize, okay, she's a member of this atheist group, and this atheist group, and this group. I go, okay, this is a non-believer here, but she cares about people with disabilities. Okay, so I said, Lynette, I said, you understand this is a Christian group, don't you? She said, that's okay, I can get along with Christians. All right, all I'm trying to say here is, think about the other stories they could have said. What was John hearing? Maybe he was hearing that Jesus was over there at this house of all these people that were drinking. And maybe they had heard that he was over at this house with these people who were publicans and prostitutes. And maybe he heard about those stories. You know, maybe that's what he was hearing the stories about Jesus and his disciples breaking the traditional rules by, you know, eating and working on the Sabbath, actually healing people on the Sabbath. Maybe those are the stories John was hearing. I don't know what they were. But, you know, we just need, as people, believers, to be very sensitive to the very special people that God has made. Sitting around a campfire, on a canoe trip, out there alone, along the banks of the Peace River, and you're sitting there at night, and all you can see are the faces of the people around, and you ask the question, okay, where do you see Jesus out here? And they began to answer, well, I saw him in the creek, I see him in the trees, I see him in the stars, I see him in the moon. And I'm saying, guys, no, you don't see him in any of those places. The only place you can see Jesus out here is a campfire in the face of someone else. We're his face. We are his face. We're his church. When the world asks, are you the church, or should we expect someone else? We need him to look at us and say, thank you, church. Thank you.
Thank you, Bill.